Disclaimer. Something very unusual happened this week. Donald Trump convened a cabinet meeting. In the middle of his vague comments, Fox News did something they rarely ever do. They abruptly cut away. When your own friendly news network decides it can't keep broadcasting you, that speaks volumes. It was shielding its audience. What they saw was a man visibly unraveling, both mentally and physically. There was no credible way to frame what everyone saw. Let's examine what actually took place. The footage that leaked is genuinely alarming. Trump attempted to walk through economic figures. He rattled off random numbers, confused countries with corporations, and lost track of his own words mid-sentence. He stated, "We're bringing back $400 billion, or maybe $500 billion. Some say $600 billion from China, Canada, European Union." He added, which is basically Germany if you think about it, and nobody has ever seen numbers like this, the biggest numbers in history. Yet none of this holds any real meaning. These aren't policy proposals. It's a man grasping for figures that sound impressive. But it's not only what he said that's revealing. Observe his physical demeanor, the way he clutched the table, the way he leaned forward as if the furniture itself was supporting him, the way his aides observed him. After the meeting, he avoided taking questions. His team whisked him away as quickly as his declining physical presence allowed. What became apparent is something insiders have quietly acknowledged. The president's staff no longer serves him in a traditional sense. They manage him, control his access, and direct his actions. Compare that with his first term. Back then, he was omnipresent. Daily press briefings, spontaneous hour-long rants. He would appear unannounced, improvising as he spoke. It was unpredictable, yes, but he was engaged and alert. Now, appearances are meticulously managed. Speeches once extemporaneous are now guided by teleprompters. Only approved questions are permitted. Media access is tightly restricted. The moment he strays from the script, he's swiftly removed. The question is why this shift has occurred. The individuals surrounding him are not necessarily pursuing the same objectives. Some sources suggest parallel communication channels, unofficial conduits feeding information, creating shadow decision-making structures. This is less about loyalty and more about influence, shaping outcomes indirectly while the figurehead occupies the title. Observers point to inconsistencies between public and private communications, highlighting a disconnect between official authority and the people controlling access. Turning to symbolism and legacy, recent months have drawn attention to certain projects. Federal infrastructure funds withheld unless specific conditions are met, such as renaming airports or public buildings. On the surface, this looks like self-promotion. Beneath the surface, it reflects a sophisticated understanding of narrative leverage, using current decisions to influence how history will record them, renaming cultural institutions, commissioning massive monuments, and orchestrating public dedications all signal a desire to solidify personal legacy. Scholars of authoritarianism note this pattern. When leaders sense the permanence of their influence is at risk, there's an intensified push to enshrine themselves. Historical examples provide context. Leaders with waning authority frequently pursue conspicuous projects to secure their place in historical memory. Late-stage examples are plentiful. Expansive architectural undertakings, renamed institutions, ceremonial dedications. These measures were often employed in regimes where consolidating power went hand in hand with building monuments that immortalized the leader. The pattern emphasizes perception over policy, a deliberate effort to control how governance is remembered. Meanwhile, adjustments in education and cultural institutions reveal a secondary focus, controlling historical knowledge. Curriculum changes, removal of exhibits, and revisions to public-facing materials indicate attempts to influence how upcoming generations interpret the past. This represents a broader strategy of narrative control, reinforcing authority and shaping societal memory. The dual approach, public spectacle and internal management, creates two overlapping realities. Outwardly, speeches, ceremonies, and appearances project stability, authority, and accomplishment. Internally, information, decision-making, and messaging are tightly curated by aides, forming a layered operational structure. The result is a bifurcated system, one for public perception, another for actual governance control. Examining federal project approvals and funding allocation reveals these dynamics in action. Conditions tied to infrastructure projects blend personal branding with official government decision-making. Using high-profile projects to influence public perception, while simultaneously building personal legacy, shows a calculated interplay of authority. Symbolic projects themselves, the monuments, dedications, and naming initiatives, serve as concrete instruments of influence. They present a visible narrative of leadership and achievement. Observers note that these efforts mirror historical patterns, seen when leaders face both temporal constraints and impermanence in authority. These projects illustrate how personal ambition intersects with institutional influence. Public communications, via social media statements and press appearances, reflect an acute concern with perception. Messaging often emphasizes self-importance, historical comparisons, and external validation. Coupled with tightly controlled access, These communications indicate a focus on historical framing rather than immediate policy outcomes. The structural consequences are substantial: concentrated influence among a small circle of aides, unofficial communication channels, and conditions placed on federal projects point to a shift in decision-making authority. Analysts interpret this as a transition from conventional hierarchical governance to a system mediated by personal networks and selective influence. Such a structure can affect policy coherence, institutional stability, and public accountability. At the same time, symbolic actions impact historical memory. Renaming institutions, erecting monuments, and shaping cultural narratives influence how leadership is documented and remembered. These acts are not purely ceremonial. They shape historiography, institutional memory, and civic identity. Recognizing this connection is essential for understanding the broader strategy at work. Public and institutional reactions add further clarity. Media coverage, commentary, and internal communications reflect awareness of these dynamics. Observers describe a mix of compliance, adaptation, and resistance among officials, demonstrating a complex interaction between authority, loyalty, and maneuvering. These responses highlight the contrast between public projection and internal operational reality. Analyzing the interplay between leadership, staff, and societal systems underscores the importance of symbolic acts in governance. Initiatives that may appear superficial or promotional are in fact mechanisms of strategic positioning. They function as tools for control, narrative shaping, and consolidating influence over both contemporary operations and historical interpretation. The implications extend beyond immediate governance. Symbolic projects influence public discourse, media framing, and institutional behavior. Analysts note that such initiatives can affect legislative priorities, funding decisions, and actions of state and local officials. Their long-term impact is structural and cultural, affecting institutional functionality and shaping historical perception. A critical element is the intersection of legacy building and cultural narratives. Modifications to curricula, museum exhibits, and public commemorations reflect a deliberate effort to shape collective memory. Selectively highlighting or omitting events guides civic understanding, public debate, and societal values. Scholars note that aligning symbolic acts with historical reinterpretation is a hallmark of long-term influence strategies. The convergence of infrastructure, monuments, and messaging demonstrates a coordinated approach. Analysts observe careful calibration of timing, visibility, and narrative coherence. Each initiative contributes to a larger framework, designed to maximize public attention, historical footprint, and operational control. The cumulative effect is a layered governance approach, where perception, symbolism, and authority reinforce one another. Staff and advisor behavior further emphasizes this duality. Reports indicate that access and communications are tightly controlled, with certain individuals exercising outsized influence. This produces a dual system, an outward-facing office projecting consistency, while internal operations are mediated through selective channels. Structural consequences include potential bottlenecks, concentrated advisor influence, and centralized narrative control. This dual system also shapes public perception. Controlled appearances, pre-approved messaging, and ceremonial initiatives suggest stability and authority. Meanwhile, internal dynamics indicate that operational control rests with a network of aides and allies. The divergence between outward projection and internal management is a key analytic point in understanding contemporary governance. The interplay of personal legacy, symbolic actions, and operational control carries broader implications for political science and historical analysis. Symbolic acts mark influence, shape narrative, and consolidate authority. Analysts note that coordinating these acts with historical reinterpretation demonstrates a sophisticated approach to managing perception, where historical record, public memory, and institutional behavior converge to reinforce power. Finally, the long-term implications merit consideration. Infrastructure projects, renaming initiatives, and cultural interventions impact immediate governance, but also influence historical documentation, civic understanding, and institutional continuity. Scholars suggest that the ultimate significance of these strategies will be visible in historical records, cultural memory, and future evaluations of leadership. In sum, what initially appears as disconnected public statements and ceremonial projects can be reframed within a larger analytic framework, which includes carefully controlled public appearances and communications, influence exercised by a small, powerful network of advisors, strategic legacy building through monuments and naming initiatives, manipulation and reinterpretation of historical and cultural narratives, long-term effects on societal understanding and historical memory. Together, these factors create a complex governance environment in which narrative, perception, and operational authority are tightly intertwined. A careful examination of these dynamics provides insight into contemporary mechanisms of power, influence, and legacy building in political leadership. As we turn to what's happening behind the scenes, it's impossible to ignore the larger picture of influence and control. The hidden layer is just as revealing. This administration functions less as a government, more as a network of influence. Insiders hold real power, while the figurehead presides symbolically. Decision-making filtered through narrow channels, information selectively shared, public appearances tightly scripted. The system manages perception first, policy second. Personal branding and political leverage intersect with government work. Federal funding held hostage over naming rights is a tactical maneuver demonstrating narrative control. The manipulation of historical narrative runs parallel. Content in institutions, museums, and educational programs has been altered, reshaped, affecting public understanding. These are not minor adjustments, they are structural interventions. By influencing what is taught and remembered, power aims to shape collective memory. It is a strategic choice: control the past to dictate the future. The implications for democracy are significant. When historical understanding is curated, citizens cannot fully assess the present. They are denied context to critically evaluate decisions or hold leaders accountable. By erasing, minimizing, or rewriting history, authority is centralized, dissent undermined, and societal understanding skewed. This has practical consequences. What we are seeing is a two-pronged strategy. High-visibility legacy projects cement personal imprint on national consciousness. On the other hand, subtle manipulation of memory and information shapes how society remembers the past and perceives the present. These forces reinforce one another. One constructs the narrative in the tangible world, the other conditions the interpretive framework. Inside the administration, sources report a growing concentration of influence. Advisors dictate information flow and decision framing. Operational authority is less important than narrative control. The figurehead becomes both shield and instrument. This is not merely conjecture. Public statements, media appearances, and federal project management reveal consistent patterns. The alignment of symbolic acts with operational control indicates an integrated approach to power: manage perception, dictate narrative, secure legacy. Let's take a closer look at the cultural interventions: changes to educational curricula, removal of historical exhibits, selective promotion of narratives. These are not isolated incidents, they are components of a larger strategy. Reshaping collective understanding influences how future citizens interpret events. This is a calculated move intended to minimize scrutiny, reduce dissent, and secure a controlled historical narrative. The consequences are visible. Communities are impacted by the framing of public memory, prioritization of federal funding, and legitimization of ideologies. Historical narrative becomes a battlefield where cultural memory is contested, and access to knowledge becomes a tool of governance. The stakes are higher than symbolic disputes. They affect how generations understand governance, rights, and social responsibility. Meanwhile, public-facing elements continue unabated. Monuments, building renamings, and orchestrated media appearances serve as markers of power. Such projects often correlate with perceived vulnerability. They act as a visual assertion of permanence, an attempt to control how history perceives the individual. This convergence of symbolic legacy building and operational influence illustrates a broader phenomenon. It reflects the interplay between authority, perception, and narrative. When structural power is filtered through networks of influence and public legacy is actively curated, the lines between reality and perception blur. Observers must evaluate not just what is being said, but who is shaping the information, how it is framed, and why it matters. Let's examine the implications for institutional integrity. Federal agencies, educational institutions, and cultural organizations are all affected. When naming rights, funding, and public recognition are tied to personal branding, institutional priorities shift. Resource allocation can become secondary. This dynamic introduces risks. It can distort decision-making, erode public trust, and complicate accountability. Historical parallels are instructive. Scholars cite instances where late-stage leaders pursued monumental projects and centralized influence. The strategic convergence of these elements provides insights into governance behavior, legacy ambitions, and methods of influence. Consider the operational consequences: decision-making bottlenecks, selective information access, and concentrated influence. When personal legacy and narrative control take precedence, systemic inefficiencies emerge. The public experiences outcomes indirectly. The cultural dimension adds another layer. Influencing educational content, museum exhibits, and commemorations control societal understanding. Future generations may inherit an interpretation of history filtered through the lens of those in power, highlighting the stakes of narrative management. Juxtapose these structural dynamics with personal behaviors. Controlled appearances, pre-approved communications, centralization of access reflect deliberate orchestration. Public appearances project confidence, while internal mechanisms manage information flow. This dual-track approach separates image and function. The implications extend to civic engagement. When the public cannot fully access information or interpret decisions, participation is constrained. The orchestration of narrative and legacy functions as a protective mechanism for the leader and a limitation on collective decision-making. Consider the broader societal impact. Monument building, renaming initiatives, and curated content influence civic understanding. By shaping which narratives are amplified and minimized, authority controls how society internalizes events and contextualizes policy. This is an enduring effect. The intersection of symbolic and operational control can generate a feedback loop. Monuments reinforce authority, validating internal influence. Conversely, selective information reinforces the symbolic narrative, creating a self-sustaining cycle of perception management and power consolidation. To understand the stakes, consider the role of public response. Media coverage, civic organizations, and educational institutions interact with these initiatives. We can also analyze the operational nuances. Networks of influence, unofficial communication, and selective access shape decision-making. Public-facing rhetoric may not reflect actual operational priorities. Ceremonial acts may serve as signals to internal actors. Historically, similar patterns emerge when leaders face declining authority. Orchestration of legacy often precedes periods of scrutiny. Comparing contemporary actions with historical precedents allows analysts to infer intent, predict outcomes, and assess risks. One critical dimension is the education and preservation of historical knowledge. Alterations to curricula shape collective memory. Controlling historical narratives is a mechanism for social influence, allowing authority to guide interpretation, minimize dissent, and reinforce ideological objectives. Public infrastructure, cultural projects, and symbolic acts function as both tangible achievements and instruments of influence. Their dual role underscores the interdependence of operational authority, legacy building, and perception management. When these elements are coordinated strategically, they create a robust framework for influence across temporal, cultural, and institutional domains. In conclusion, high visibility initiatives, selective information control, and narrative curation illustrate a sophisticated approach to legacy management. These actions have implications for operational governance, institutional integrity, civic understanding, and historical memory. The long-term effect will not be the monuments themselves. It will be the societal understanding, historical interpretation, and civic memory shaped during this period. Legacy, narrative, and power are now intertwined in unprecedented ways. This provides a framework for understanding contemporary governance. Federal projects, cultural institutions, and public communications all intersect with these larger dynamics. Decisions today shape future understanding. For citizens, observers, and policymakers, awareness, documentation, and analysis are critical. Track actions, record outcomes, evaluate dynamics. This preserves an accurate record of events, ensuring accountability and safeguarding historical memory. As the administration continues its maneuvers, it falls on the public to maintain perspective, question narrative framing, and resist undue influence. This is not just politics. It is a matter of civic responsibility and the integrity of societal memory. Every rename building, monument, ceremonial act is about influence, narrative, and shaping future generations. Vigilance, engagement, and documentation are required. For those watching this unfold, there's a tangible call to action. Stay informed, record events, analyze developments, and engage critically. Civic literacy, historical awareness, and active participation are the tools that preserve societal understanding and ensure legacy is not dictated by power. Finally, the takeaway is clear. Preservation of history, accountability, and civic awareness falls on all of us. Resisting narrative manipulation is essential. So, keep tracking, keep questioning, and most importantly, keep recording the truth. Hit that like button, subscribe to Economic Records, and turn on notifications. Stay vigilant, stay informed, and stay engaged.